So Dan, here we are in your intellectual bat cave, and I know you've got pictures of papyri, and you've actually got some real stuff for us to look at.
Yeah.
And how do we know it's real? How do we know it's not like some kind of knockoff, fake, or whatever?
Well, I got some papyrus in Cairo,
Okay.
and you would normally expect them to have the real stuff. What you see, what happens is a lot of banana leaves are pressed together and sold as papyrus. But you can tell that this is real papyrus this way. It doesn't taste like banana, it's salty. This is real papyrus. So I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't have guests do this. It's like the Blarney style. I don't want to have a pandemic on my hands. But you notice, you see it up to the light, you can see you've got these horizontal fibers.
Right.
And on all scroll manuscripts or roll manuscripts, they wrote out along the horizontal fibers, and then they'd roll it up. And on the backside, you see the vertical fibers, which were just holding it in place. They're just back, and you can feel this.
Yeah.
It's pretty durable material.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So much more durable than paper. And so that's how they would do it. But when the New Testament was copied, our earliest copies, our earliest fragment, in fact, is probably papyrus number 52. And that was found at Manchester University, the John Rylands Library. It had been dug up in Egypt, and a young, newly minted PhD, C.H. Roberts, was going through a shoebox and found this little fragment about the size of a credit card.
Wow. And
And he found writing on one side and writing on the back side. And he deciphered it. It was a professional scribe who did that. I can take this. And that scribe had written out John 18, verses 31 through 33 on one side. And the back was 37, 38, John 18. So he knew this was not written on a roll. It was written on a codex, where you know, our modern book form.
Right.
Unless you're 30 years old or younger, you've probably never seen a real codex, because all you do is scroll on your computer, so you go retro on us, you know.
Right.
But the codex form, we're not exactly sure who invented it, but we know it was invented in the first century, mid-first century, maybe late. All of our New Testament books were almost certainly written on a roll. When John talks about the seven sealed book in Revelation, there has to be a roll. He says you can't break the seals, the next seal. If you had a codex and you had these wax seals on it, you could slice through to the last section and find out who done it. But you can't with a roll, because as you roll through it, you got this line of wax, and you got to cut through that to get to the next chapter and things. So all of our New Testament manuscripts are written on a codex from the very earliest stages. 95% of all Christian manuscripts up through the year about 500, the first 5 centuries of Christianity, are written on a codex.
Mm-hmm.
And less than 15% of all non-Christian works are written on a codex for those 500 years. It's the first, and I think probably the only time in the history of the church where we were actually ahead of the technological curve.
Wow.
So,
And the material culture, like going to the codex, obviously it's not just like an interesting technological thing, but what's bound together obviously tells us a lot about the canonicity of Scripture, right?
Right. Yeah, once the codex form comes about, you can actually have more than one gospel in there. The longest really usable roll to make a book would be about 35 feet. Luke and Acts and Matthew would take up right around 28 feet. So you couldn't even put another gospel in, maybe a small letter, that's it. Once you have a codex form, now it's just as big as you want it to be. And I'll have to show you my Codex Vaticanus that shows how thick that is. But you could have the 4 gospels. And in the 2nd century, we know of codices that actually had all 4 gospels in them. Now, once you have that, now it raises a question. What's the order of these books? Mm-hmm. And we think, well, gospels first. Actually, the whole church thought the same thing. But they didn't all think Revelation last. Some of them put Paul's letters last. And even in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the earliest form was probably Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark, to put the apostles first. And in fact, I have images of one of these papyri, P45. These are volumes that of the manuscripts we photographed at the Chester Beatty. And we've got P45, 4 Gospels, and Acts, and then P46, which has Paul's letters, and then P47, which has Revelation. We shot against a white background and a black background. And Paul's letters, what's the order going to be? Well, Romans is always first, but this has Hebrews second, because the Greeks felt that Hebrews was written by Paul, and therefore it's Scripture. The Western Church thought it was not written by Paul, therefore it's not Scripture. So it struggled for canonicity. Both sides finally decided whoever the author is, it's Scripture. But it floats around in Paul's letters. So in P46, a Greek manuscript, Hebrews comes right after Romans.
So do you lean toward Pauline authorship?
Oh, not
for
at all.
Hebrews?
No, I would
What do you
lean
think?
very, very hard
Apollos?
against it. Who knows?
No.
You know, it may be two guys. I think Apollos and Barnabas are probably the front runners. But
When I was at Dallas Seminary, there's a story that probably happened in the 70s. Maybe you know about it, but someone evidently called Dr. Walver in the middle of the night and said, I know who wrote it. And he's like, what are you talking about? He goes, I know who wrote Hebrews. And I think they said Apollos or whatever. So
he probably flunked out, didn't he?
yeah, I probably didn't do so well.
Wow. That's
I don't know if you've heard that story.
No, I had not.
Okay.
That's a great neophyte
So
story.
on like the codices again, obviously what's included tells us a lot about authority and canonicity and all that sort of thing, the early church. And these are emerging in disparate areas. So it's not just one area. They're all kind of coming up with very similar codices. So were there any early attempts, like say 3rd century when Gnosticism's really big, of trying to fold in Gospel of Thomas or Gospel of Mary and make it seem like, oh, the church is more diverse and the canon's a lot bigger and you Christians are crazy just having these 4 Gospels? Or even modern attempts to do that.
The modern attempt by the Jesus Seminar has a book called The 5 Gospels.
Right.
And they put in colored beads to decide. 80 scholars threw in colored beads voting if Jesus said on the words of Jesus. And their 5th gospel is Thomas. But if Jesus said something as a red bead, if the idea goes back to Jesus, pink. If it's probably not Jesus, gray. If definitely Jesus did say it, it's black. I've got a set of those beads given to me by the head, Robert Funk.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But Thomas was ruled out very early on. But here's the thing. 1 or 2 local places had it as canonical for a little bit. But here's the thing about Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, Philip, Judas. They put their names on it. And you don't have that with Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John originally. They were anonymous.
Yeah.
So why is it that you have it on these and not those?
Yeah.
Because they are the gospel according to Matthew. It's not the gospel of Matthew. It's the same story, but Matthew's the one who's giving the portrait. So he's not nearly as important as like the letter of Paul. See?
Yeah.
But to get a 2nd century document or a 3rd century document to get into favor of the church, you put a famous apostles or some of the disciples of Jesus, put their name on it.
Yeah.
And that's the only way you can catch up. And so Thomas was like that. It actually is a 2nd century document.
It is interesting that, famous, Lane Poggles, famous Gnostic, would love the Gospel of Thomas when it says a woman has to become a man.
I don't think she'd like that.
And it's like, wow.
That's the last Logion
Yeah.
1:14.
Right.
Peter says, let Mary Magdalene, go out from among us because women are not worthy of the life. And Jesus said, look, I'll turn her into one of you guys so she can be in heaven. So it's the first transgender gospel, really, but in the wrong direction.
Right. Show us here on the computer what you've got.
Well, this is an image from P45, one of these papyri, on Mark chapter 8, and it has verse 22 in it. And we transcribed, the folks at CSNTM transcribed most of this manuscript. And as we worked through it, you've got some little bits of ink that you don't have the full line. And you can see right here, this looks like shredded wheat with somebody spilled some black coffee on it or something, some dots. But by looking at how the letters are formed everywhere else in this, and we we took photographs of a number of these representative letters. We could tell what this is, and it's different from what scholars have said before. Let me go back here. Right here you see this, and we blow it up in the animation. It says that Jesus came to Bethsaida.
Yeah.
He came rather than they came.
Yeah.
It's only a 2-letter difference, but
It gives an emphasis.
yeah, we're trying to get exactly what the original text said, and these early manuscripts are all important to help us get
That's
there.
great. Yeah. So I've noticed, you can't help but notice, you've got a lot of memento mori, remember that you're mortal, 3 skulls around here. So what's the story of, let's say, this skull right here?
Well, I wanted to have a skull to remind me of my own mortality, inspired by St. Jerome, who carried a human skull around him as he was doing his research. He moved to Bethesda so he could learn Hebrew, and he lived there for 35 years, did the Latin Vulgate, and there's a statue in the courtyard in Bethesda of him and a human skull at his feet. I like to visit cemeteries to remind me that I'm not going to live forever. And every day has to count for Jesus Christ. It's all we have. And we don't know what tomorrow's going to be. So that's why I like to have a skull around to remind me of that.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thanks so much.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.